On today's Locked On Giants podcast, takeaways, observations, and more from New York Giants OTA number 2. That's coming your way next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all of our written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. And thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And we've got a lot to cover today, folks. The Giants went through OTA number 2. The media was allowed in. I was there, had a slew of notes, observations, takeaways, and I'm going to run through them for you. We'll talk about the injuries and the personnel and some impressions that I had there. We'll talk about the quarterback position and how those guys did. And then we'll wrap things up with just some general thoughts about the roster and some other little, FYIs that came out of, or at least my impressions that came out of today's OTA. So let's jump right in because, again, we've got a lot to cover. All right, let's start off with the personnel and the injuries. Now, as expected, not everybody was able to participate in the OTA. There were a couple guys, head coach Brian Daboll said we're dealing with a stomach flu, but you also had some guys who are rehabbing from injuries, and they're still rehabbing. Andrew Thomas obviously was one. He was held out of practice. Dexter Lawrence went through the warm-ups, but then he didn't do anything in the team drill. Tyrone Tracy, for some reason, wasn't taking part in any of the drills. I'm not sure why. Paulson Adebo was in there coming off of that broken leg, so he did everything. Bobby Okereke did everything. But the one guy that was kind of a surprise and is generating the headlines was Malik Nabers, wide receiver. Now, Malik Nabers, according to Brian Daboll, Malik Nabers is dealing with a toe issue. And if you remember, he was on the injury report towards the end of last season with a toe issue, amongst other stuff. Daboll said that this is actually an issue that has dated back to Nabers' days at LSU. So he didn't have a procedure. Daboll just basically said, look, we want to be smart with him. We're not going to put him out there, probably because it's so early in the process, in the OTA process. And plus, they kind of know what they've got with him. So, Jalen Hyatt, who I'll talk about a little later, he stepped in and he took Malik Nabers' reps. But here's kind of what, raised my antenna, if you will. And I don't mean to sound like a negative Nelly because I certainly don't want this to happen, but if Malik Nabers has an ongoing issue with that toe and they're resting him now, considering how important he is to the offense, what's going to happen when we get into training camp and then the season? Are they going to have to manage his reps? Are they going to have to, cut back on his reps in the game? I mean, this is a guy that you want out on the field every possible turn. So, hopefully the injury that he has, whatever it is with the toe, it does heal up properly to where he doesn't need surgery. But, I think back, and I know this is a different player, a different injury, different, everything. But remember, Andrew Thomas had an ankle issue when he came to the pros. And ultimately, he had to have surgery done on that ankle to get it finally fixed. Hopefully, Malik Nabers does not need to go through that. But it's something that I think we need to kind of keep an eye on or file it away and hope that, it doesn't rear its ugly head. But if it does, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, again, it won't be an issue. Now, Malik Nabers, he pushed through a lot last year. So I got to give him credit for being tough. But, when you have a toe issue, that can certainly affect your gait. It can affect your stride, how you walk, everything. And, Malik Nabers, hopefully that won't happen to him. So something there to keep an eye on. Now, I just want to talk real quick about the roster in general, because as I was watching practice unfold, I have to say, this is probably one of the deepest and best rosters that the Giants have had in a while, certainly under Brian Dable. And by that, I mean, you don't really see much of a drop off in between, the first team and the second team. All right. Now, asterisk here. It was a non padded practice, no contact. But usually, this time of year, you see a lot of mistakes, especially since this is the only the second OTA where you have offense working against defense. As far as I can tell, there weren't a whole lot of mistakes. It just seemed like this roster, whether it was experience or skill level or whatever, to me, this roster just looks probably like the best one that Brian Dable has had. Um, some of the lineup changes, real quick. I mean, well, not lineup changes, but guys that they plugged in. To give you an example, for Andrew Thomas, they had James Hudson III play left tackle, and next to him, in place of John Runyon Jr., who also didn't work, they had Aaron Stinney. All right, and again, as far as I could tell, they seem to be moving well, and again, there wasn't offense versus defense with the pads on where offensive linemen were really getting after their guy, but I didn't see a whole lot in terms of pressures. And usually, this time of year, you see the defense have an advantage because the offensive linemen can't really block the defensive guys because of the non-contact nature. You didn't see a whole lot of that in this particular practice. So that was encouraging. The second team left side, for what it's worth, Joshua Azudu was at left tackle and Evan Neal was at left guard. All right. That was kind of an interesting move, I thought, because Evan Neal, as you guys and gals probably know, he last played left guard, I believe, in 2019 at Alabama. He has since been a tackle. All right. Both at Alabama and both at the Giants. So I just found it interesting that they're kind of cross training him over at left guard, which is, in my opinion, what they should have done right from the get go. All right. That was a position Evan Neal did well with when he was at Alabama. And I never really, I got it. They wanted to convert him to a right tackle. That didn't work out. There was some thought that maybe he would challenge Greg Van Roten for right guard. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the impression I got today, just in hearing Van Roten speak, and he was excellent, by the way. He actually went into a deep dive in response to a question I asked him about Evan Neal. And I'll play that clip for you a little later in the show about the challenges of playing, converting to guard. But, Greg Van Roten spoke about the importance of the offensive line establishing continuity. This is something that really the Giants haven't really been able to do. And he thinks that, if everybody can stay healthy and they all stay together, the starting five from last year, the start of the season, Thomas, Runyon, Schmitz, Van Roten, and Illuminor, he thinks they could be all that much better, which is going to be key because if that offensive line struggles, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. We're going to have problems if that O-line struggles. Okay, coming up next, we're going to talk about the quarterbacks, Jaxson Dart, Jameis Winston, Russell Wilson, Tommy DeVito. That's coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. Feeling good about the New York Knicks and the Eastern Conference Finals? Can they pull this one out? Well, why not explore the different categories where you can win big, such as player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays? Just think your first $5 winning bet can yield you $200 in bonus bets to add to the excitement. So if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. We are continuing our coverage of Giants spring football. We're talking about OTAs today, and we will continue. I'll have some more thoughts for you probably in the next show that I do. And we'll just continue bringing you updates. The next time the media is in the building for an OTA will be a week from Thursday. So we'll be in the building. I think that's going to be OTA number 6, if I'm not mistaken. So we're in that for number 6. And then I think we're in the following Thursday after that. And then it's the 2-day mandatory mini camp, and then we call it a break. We take a break for the summer until training camp. So I'm going to have all that for you. I'm going to be there at as many of those practices as I can make, and I'll have the updates for you as quickly as I can. All right, let's get back to OTA number 2. We're going to talk about the quarterbacks. Now, this was kind of interesting. I was kind of curious to see how the rotation would work out as far as who got X number of snaps. And unofficially, it seemed that Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston and Jaxson Dart all got pretty much the same amount of snaps. All right. You would have thought that Russell Wilson, being the starter, would have got more snaps, but I guess because the quarterback room is so brand new, they wanted to maybe distribute it as much as evenly as possible. Really, Tommy DeVito was the only one of the quarterbacks who didn't get a whole lot of snaps. I think he had something like 3 or 4, whereas Wilson and Winston and Dart, Wilson and Winston, I think had, I want to say 15, and I think Dart had 13 altogether between the 11-on-11 and the 7-on-7. So, obviously Wilson worked with the first team, but you know what? Winston got some first team reps, and so did Dart. So how did they do? Well, Dart, let's start there. Dart got actually 3 first team reps, all of them on the goal line. He had 1 touchdown pass. He ran for a touchdown. And then there was one that was picked off. He kind of tried to force it into a tight window and it was picked off. So, worth noting, Brian Dable, as was the case at the rookie camp, Brian Dable was attached to Jaxson Dart's hip. All right, which means that Brian Dable, by the way, was not on the radio. It was Mike Kafka, for those of you who might be wondering. I know I've mentioned that before, but, I just thought I'd mention that. Wilson and Winston, Wilson had a decent day. I didn't see anything, too crazy as far, there were a couple of drops and maybe one misfired pass. Winston, on the other hand, his first pass was an interception. It was picked off by Dane Belton. But to be fair, the ball was actually bobbled by Zach Pascal, the receiver, and it was volleyed up, and Dane Belton was able to pick it off. He was in the vicinity and he got it. But Winston also, later on in the practice, put a ball into a tight window that really he had no business throwing into. And Micah McFadden, inside linebacker, should have technically come down with it, but he didn't. He dropped it. So really, Winston should have had 2 interceptions on the day, but he got away with 1 there. This is what we're going to get with Winston if he has to play. He's going to take risks, and some of them are going to pay off, and some of them are not. So, Wilson, I think, was a little bit more on the conservative side, if I'm being honest with you, based on what I was able to see. So now I want to talk a little bit more about Dart because, so far so good with the rookie, but there's one thing that, one of many things I should say, but one thing in particular kind of stands out that I wonder if the coaches are going to try and smooth out a little bit with him. And that is that regardless of the depth of the pass attempt by Jaxson Dart, he's putting a lot of mustard on the pass. All right. I don't see, or I haven't seen in the practices that I've seen Dart, take part in, I haven't seen very many balls, if any balls, thrown with any kind of touch. And that's something that I think needs to develop with Jaxson Dart because, look, there's going to be a time when you have to saw through the coverage and the waving arms and whatnot to get the ball to its intended target. And there's going to be times when you don't really have to, zip the ball in. If a guy goes out for a 5-yard route in the flat, for example, you don't really have to zip it in there, especially if there's nobody around. And I'm just kind of curious to see when Dart gets in, live snaps, how many drop balls his receivers have. And if the drop balls are a result of, the receivers just not, being caught off guard by the velocity of the pass, or, if it's just, they're just dropping them in general. But that's something to keep an eye on. this summer. It's not something that they can't overcome, but it's just something that I think Dart needs to really work on. And then there's also times when, there was one pass in particular, it was a deep ball, and he threw it and he kind of didn't set his feet. He kind of muscled it through the air and it was a completion. So, it worked. But ultimately, you want to see him set his feet if he's going to, throw the ball deep because you're going to be able to get a little bit more push on the ball and you're also going to have maybe a little better result as opposed to just slinging it from, using your arm to just sling it in midair. The catch of the day was I think it was Wilson. I had Wilson down as the passer. Threw a beautiful pass. It was a short pass to Darius Slayton. Darius Slayton tiptoed. He caught it in the corner of the end zone. He kind of tiptoed a little bit to stay in bounds. Did a really nice job with that. So that's probably the play of the day. Unfortunately, we couldn't film it, so I didn't have it for you on social media. But I have some other clips on my social media accounts if you want to check it out. I'll be posting those probably throughout the night. I've got a whole bunch of clips and stuff. All right. Now, let's talk about Jalen Hyatt just real quick, because I mentioned he was getting most of the first team reps with Malik Nabers sideline with the toe issue. Jalen Hyatt, one of the things with Jalen Hyatt, I think that has held him back has been his route running. Because remember, when he came out of Tennessee, there were some concerns about, the fact that he hadn't really run the entire route tree and, his route running really needed, a lot more work to it. And, he's been working at it. I know there were times last season when he was frustrated and, the frustration kind of went both ways, but they're sticking with him. And I thought he had a good practice. I really did. I mean, the routes were a lot better. He did a better job of kind of shielding the ball against defenders. I didn't really see anybody get in there with a hand to knock a ball away. So I thought Jalen Hyatt, all things considered, had a pretty good practice on Wednesday, during OTA number 2. And that was nice to see because, look, Jalen Hyatt, he's got the speed. And look, the competition he has right now, even though it's not really true competition, is if he doesn't show progress this spring, you could bet anything that the Giants will look to bring in another receiver who can maybe be that outside threat. Because remember, when we talk about Gabe Davis making a visit with the Giants, Gabe Davis would probably give the Giants that other outside receiver that they don't have. So you pair him with Darius Slayton on the outside, maybe put Malik Nabers in the slot on some of the pass attempts. And now you've got a whole new wrinkle that you didn't necessarily have a whole lot of last year, and one that could potentially be successful because, good luck trying to figure out who you're going to double team. Is it going to be Nabers? Is it going to be Hyatt? Is it going to be, Slayton? So the Giants are really kind of banking on Jalen Hyatt to take that big step forward. And look, it's the spring. There's no, bump and run. The cornerbacks can't, hit you within that 5-yard range. No contact, but the concentration was there. I didn't see any, major mistakes. Again, from what I could see from Jalen Hyatt, I thought the routes were a little bit crisper. I didn't see him rounding routes off. So very encouraging performance from Jalen Hyatt, who is without question in a make or break year this season. All right, folks, coming up next, some final thoughts on OTA number 3, including some of the challenges that Evan Neal is potentially looking at in converting to guard. So don't go anywhere. I'll have that for you right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and I'm running down OTAs, the highlights, the takeaways, and so on and so forth, what we learned in the media. And you know what? I have so much here that I'll probably do another show for you tomorrow on some of the things I don't get to today. So we'll talk about some of that stuff. We'll save some of that stuff for tomorrow, just to, to make sure you have everything. All right. Some final thoughts from the OTAs. I mentioned Evan Neal and him working at guard. And, I asked Brian Dable what Evan Neal's biggest transition or obstacle, if you will, is going to be in making the conversion. And Dable, he wasn't having it. He just basically said, he's working hard. Evan Neal's working hard. He's embraced it, yada, yada, yada. Okay, great. I thought, my question was fair, but apparently Dable didn't want to give anything up. So anyway, I put the question to Greg Van Roten, who was one of the guys brought to the podium. And Greg Van Roten, I asked him about, what's the biggest obstacle. Now, I know Greg Van Roten has never played tackle, so he can't speak to the tackle to guard conversion, but Greg Van Roten gave an outstanding answer regarding the challenges of playing inside and why it's not as easy as simply, playing in a phone booth. So I'm going to play that clip for you right now so you can hear it. And then I'll come back and I'll talk a little bit about what Van Roten had to say. Greg, in your experience, I know Evan Neal played guard in college. He hasn't played it in the pros, but in terms of the transition, what is the biggest, I think, adjustment, if you will, he has to make in switching from tackle to inside?
Well, I've never played tackle in the NFL. So
right, but you've seen a lot.
I can't speak to how hard that position is, but I played guard and I played center. And I just know that inside, things happen faster. The guys are bigger, and there's a lot of moving parts. So if a defense is static, it's easy to play guard, but they're not static. They're very dynamic. And that's probably one of the challenges that goes kind of under the radar is how fast things can happen and how many things you need to be able to process in a short period of time. So whereas tackles, I think Sean O'Hara said, they're kind of on the right side or left side of the highway, and they're kind of worried about what's going on over there. When you're in the middle, there's a lot more you have to kind of take in a short period of time, and it's not easy. There's not a lot of starting guards in the NFL for a reason. So.
Is it though a benefit that you're in a quote unquote phone booth inside? Does that help?
I don't think so, honestly. With the ability that you see that these defensive linemen these days, they're not these big fat slugs anymore. They're very athletic, dynamic. You look at the young guy that we drafted in the third round. He's a big dude, but he's very athletic. And then you look at, Dex inside. That is not someone I would say that is I want in a phone booth. So, just me personally. So there's definitely, they're closer to you, but that doesn't mean that it's easier to block them.
All right. Now, the one thing that kind of stood out from what Van Roten said was footwork. The guys that you now face inside, the interior defensive linemen are more athletic. They're quicker. They're stronger. They're not, to use Van Roten's words, a big fat slug anymore, which, by the way, made everybody laugh. I mentioned that because one of the issues with Evan Neal when he was playing tackle was his feet. So one of the things I think we're going to have to look at this summer when the pads go on and Evan Neal is in there is how is his footwork? Is it any better working inside? Van Roten made a good point. He's like, it's not necessarily an advantage because now you're working in a phone booth. And he also, with his answer, I feel, gave a little insight as to why guards are suddenly cashing in on the free agency market. So I really thought that was a great answer by Van Roten to my question, and certainly cleared up a lot for me because it was something I was curious about, All right. Another guy that came to the podium to speak was Bobby Okereke. Now, Bobby Okereke, he had the season-ending disc issue. Poor guy. He talked about how tough that injury was, how he couldn't even sit for a couple of weeks, and ouch, I could feel his pain, having had lower back issues myself. But Bobby Okereke just seemed rejuvenated. He struggled last year in Shane Bowen's defense. It was kind of different from what he had been asked to do in Wink Martindale's defense. And, just listening to Bobby talk, he sounded more confident in what he was doing. He sounded more comfortable in this defense. And you just get the feeling that Bobby Okereke, whatever frustration he might have had earlier in the year or towards the end of last year, that all that has kind of worked itself out. And you know what? The Giants need Bobby Okereke to really step up and be the player he was his first season with the Giants, when he didn't miss a snap, when he led the team in tackles, and he was, just a playmaker. That guy wasn't there last year because of the change in the defense. but he was very optimistic, like I said. Matter of fact, I'm going to play the clip for you in which he spoke about that. And you can hear for yourself what he had to say.
I feel like year 2 in this system, everybody being on the same page with the understanding will be very good.
Did you feel that hesitancy at times? Just not sure 100%?
I mean, tough to say. I mean, looking back at last year, you have to go back and watch the film and all that. But yeah, just moving forward with this year, just very, very excited.
Okay, so Bobby Okereke, I think he's going to have a bounce back year. If we're looking at a guy who potentially could be the quote unquote comeback player of the year for the Giants, I think you've got to put Bobby Okereke in that mix and see how he ends up doing. So, all right, Giant fans, I do have more observations, more general thoughts. I'm going to save them for tomorrow's show. So that's going to wrap up today's show. Hope you enjoyed it. I will have tomorrow's show out for you as quickly as I can. And I'll go through some of these other general observations and takeaways and just kind of, thoughts that I was able to pick up based on what I saw, things I heard, and, that sort of thing. So I will continue to bring you that content. Hope you will tune in. Thank you so much for tuning in today to the Locked On Giants podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. For your second listen today, make sure you check out Locked On NFL Scouting. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, hosts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.